cóseme el flanco, la herida aguda y la negra llaga de mi costado. Con una aguja, con hilo blanco, con la carrucha en tu regazo, cóseme el flanco, la herida aguda y la negra llaga de mi costado. Mi desventura, tu sola bruja con tus puntadas lentas y largas de hábil sutura, ciégala, 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 ciégala. Con una aguja, con hilo blanco, con la carrucha en tu regazo, cóseme el flanco, la herida aguda y la negra llaga de mi costado. Mi desventura.
Welcome to Dead Air Live. Tonight's show is called Central America, Friend or Foe. My name is Nancy Frayne, and I work with the Central America Referendum Campaign in Somerville. Tonight's program will be in 3 parts. The first part will be a slideshow by Jim Harney, whose slides you've already seen in the beginning of the program. The second part will be a videotape by Charles Kelly, who's recently returned from a trip to Nicaragua with the Artists Brigade. And the final part of the program will be a panel discussion with people who have direct experience in Central America or have experience doing educational and political work about Central America in this country. During that time, you will be able to call in to the program with questions you may have for the panelists, and I'll be announcing the telephone number at that time. Now I'd like to introduce Jim Harney. Jim, you're going to do a slideshow for us. Can you tell us a little bit about the reason that you've made the slideshow and your intent, what you'd like people to get out of this?
Well, what I've tried to do is to visit El Salvador as often as I possibly can, to get into the countryside, to talk with people. They're the people without any voices. That's what the Catholic bishops in Latin America call the poor. And what I've tried to do is best I possibly can photograph the people, to be with the people, to get a sense of the life that they're living under, especially in the midst of an intense war. And then to come home to the United States and to do what a Salvadoran told me a long time ago: go back to the United States, tell your people what's going on in this country.
What kind of experiences have you had in Central America? Why do you go, and what do you do there?
Central America is the key foreign policy issue here in the United States. I mean, it's going to get very, very tough in the days ahead for the Central American people, especially if Reagan gets elected. And what I've been trying to do is to get to know the people in El Salvador, to understand why they're going through a life and death process, why many of the poor are opting for revolution. And you see the blatant poverty in the countryside. It's terrible, and it helps explain why so many of the poor bellow out at some point during the day, revolución o muerte, it's revolution or death, because they can't be pushed down any further into the planet. And I think that's the root causes of why poverty is the cause as to why people are trying to change the structures of violence in the country. And so I'm trying to understand it as best I can, and to go around this country talking as much as I possibly can to tell their story. I always leave El Salvador very much energized by the hope of the people. I mean, and I never figured that the people could have any hope when they're living in a situation like that, but they're always looking towards the future. you know. And they're looking towards building a new El Salvador so that their children will grow up in a different kind of atmosphere, so that they're not living in grinding poverty that cuts them down. So I think
What's the message that you would like people to leave with after seeing your slideshow?
When it comes time to vote, to make sure that they cast a vote for the Central American referendum, because it's a way of being in solidarity with the poor in Central America, and they're counting on us. We have to really develop a sense of the species so that we realize that our sisters and brothers in Central America are in a very risk-taking situation, and they're counting on us to help change U.S. foreign policy, and we can do that by voting for the referendum.
Okay. Thank you very much. And now we'd like to go to the slides that Jim will now narrate for us. Can you wait just 1 minute, and we're getting the slides set up, and Jim Harney is getting in place to show you more of the slides that you saw earlier in the program. He'll be able to describe a little bit more of what's going on, what he saw, what he heard the people say. So we'll just wait a minute until he's ready. Now let's go to the slides.
This picture was taken in El Salvador in the elections, and it kind of gives you an example as to the atmosphere in which people cast their vote. These are how many people were in front of the polls. And this is where people got their ballot, and they had to stick their finger in that bottle of ink, which was an indelible ink that landed on the finger for some 4 days. So it was an atmosphere of fear that elected Napoleon Duarte, the man you see here. And since he has been elected president, the air war in El Salvador has intensified, and that's why I went back to El Salvador in the middle of June and stayed through July. This is the Guazapa area where the bombing is very, very intense. And I had to walk 12 hours to get out into the countryside, and this is Julia, a woman that walked with me, and she was a very, very beautiful woman. And I asked her, Julia, why didn't you stay in San Salvador? And she looked at me and she said, you know, the reason I didn't stay in San Salvador is because I have a great affection for my people, and she wanted to walk the 12 hours to go out and work in the countryside with the people who were being bombed daily. And she put herself in an incredible amount of risk, this woman. And her shoes fell off as she was walking. She fell off, and when she fell one time, I picked her up and I kept on walking with her for about a half hour, and she kept on going in spite of the tremendous odds that were against her. It's very hard walking in the countryside, especially during the rainy season. And this is Jose Guillermo on the left. He walked with me also. There were 45 of us, and he was a college student, and he worked in literacy programs in the countryside. This man is just not relaxing. He's sitting under a tree as engine-propelled trains, engine-propelled planes were shooting rockets into the population, and oftentimes they would fly for a good 3 or 4 hours over the area. So many people, in effect, weren't able to plow the fields. They weren't able to cultivate the agriculture. So it was here they were hiding, and oftentimes those rockets are deadly accurate, and they can pick off people if they see them out in the open. These were some of the 100 or so refugees that had fled an area called Radiola, and they had fled simply because of the bombing that was so extensive. One of the interesting things about the people in the countryside is their astounding hope. In spite of the grueling poverty, they still have a sense of what they're all about, and they gladly affiliate with the people who are opposing the government, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. This is Margarita. And the woman, I spoke with her in her home. It was bombed 3 hours earlier by an A-37 jet plane that blew off the roof of her home. The air war is being directed against the civilian population. This is a home that was destroyed. President Duarte came to the United States and he pointed out that no civilians were being bombed. So as a result, the Congress and the Senate allocated $70 million in military aid to El Salvador. It's now $196 million, and it's basically going to beef up the air war to bring more helicopters into the countryside. And again, it's trying to stop a people who are trying to get a second chance on this planet.
trying to change their lives so that they can live as more fully human, as one Salvadoran told me. And this is the kind of poverty that's so prevalent in the countryside. This, it's the children that comprise about 70% of the population. And these were kids that I spent time with in a school. Well, it was a school under a tree. I took a picture. 5 minutes later, a Huey helicopter came over and started shooting machine gun bullets at us. And we had to go into that tunnel called a Tatu. And when we were in there, I was looking at the face of a teacher, and she said to me, "You ought to be here when there were 5 helicopters shooting at us." And I could see the fear in the faces of the kids crying. That had an enormous impact on me. And I'll never forget coming back to the United States and reading an article in the New York Times. And if I hadn't been in this kind of a situation, I probably would have read this article, been outraged, and then kind of forgot about it a couple of days later. But what the article said was that the United States was possibly going to send to El Salvador a machine gun that would shoot some 18,000 rounds per minute. And I thought of these children that you're seeing here, that they're going to be the objects of the pilots who are flying the helicopter gunships. And the kind of fright that they've got to go through every day. It's constant, day in, day out. These are the people called the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. They're people who come mostly from the poor. 80% of the countryside's illiterate, and yet, they're working. This is a military training camp, and they told me that most of the guns coming to the FMLN were coming through the Salvadoran army. The war is very, very intense. Most of the press in the United States says it's a stalemate, but I don't believe so. I think that the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front is winning the war. And it helps explain why the United States is so concerned about sending military aid to President Duarte. This is Roberto, a young boy that I met walking along the road. And Roberto's 12, and I took a photograph of him. And I met him a couple of days with the unit you just saw earlier, some of the 100 or so FMLN troops. And Roberto came up to me and he said, "Could I get a photograph?" And I said, "No, I have to develop it in the United States." And I told him I'd love to come back to El Salvador sometime when there's peace and show you it. And then he said, "But I won't. But all of us won't be alive then." Here are some of the leaders of a toma de tierra. It's a takeover of land. And this one fellow, Roberto, said to me, "Hopefully when you return to El Salvador, Jim, you'll find me alive. But in case you don't, rest assured I won't have died ignorant but conscious, and I won't have died with my arms folded." This man is Carlos. And I spoke with him, and he told me about his daughter being raped. She was killed. A rod was put for her head, and her eyes pulled out. I got very, very nervous talking to this man, and I started to smile out of nervousness. And I really wanted to get my running shoes on. And then he went on to tell me that it's important to stop military aid to his country because we could get more food or possibly more medical aid, he told me. And these are some people who are fleeing the military. It's called a guinda. And I woke up in the early morning and walked with these people some 3 hours. In the dark of the morning, I saw them walking very briskly. I began to cry out of the emotion. It was so intense. But this is a common phenomenon. Sometimes to escape some 7,000 to 8,000 troops, they come into the countryside. It's constant, day in and day out. Right now in El Salvador, there's an invasion by the Salvadoran army in the Morazon province, and it's basically hitting the civilian population. They're the ones who pay the price. And here are some of the called militia people, and their basic task is to protect the civilian population who are being threatened daily. Out of the 50,000 people who have died in El Salvador, most of them are civilians. They're not hitting the FMLN, they're touching people like you see here. This is Atilio, one of the leaders of what they call a Poder Popular Local. It's the civilian leadership in the area. And he, when I was leaving, the night before I was leaving, he came up and he gave me some beans. And this is after they told me they had hardly any food in the area. There's this one fella, Amando, and Esperanza. They came up to me one night, and here they are here. And they said, well, we only have tortillas. So they gave me some tortillas, and later Atilio came in and gave me the food. And he said, eat the food. And I said, no, I'd like to share it. And Armando and Esperanza's family was there. One of the kids had a bloated belly. And then they said, eat the food. So I got the point, and I started to eat it. And then Atilio came back to me, and he said, you know, we've analyzed this situation very thoroughly, that you have to go tomorrow, and it's important that you eat, because if you get sick, it's going to be bad, not only for you, but for all of us, so eat the beans. And I stayed in this home for 4 nights, 20 people slept on the floor. The next morning I got up, and Armando came down to show me his rice crop, and as he was talking to me about agriculture and the rice crop, how the peasants kind of like integrate into the popular movement by developing the agriculture. It's so important to develop food. 837 jet plane came over the hill as we were talking, so we started to run to a tunnel, and I was in the tunnel with Armando and his boy Oscar. And then the bomb went off when the plane came in again. It was a 250-pound bomb, and Armando fortunately chose another tattoo, because if he chose the one that you're seeing here, that tunnel, we would have all been killed, because the bomb went off about right in that area. And Armando's home was destroyed. Again, it's the civilian population that's being hurt by this whole war. And when I was with him, I could see the hope in his eyes. He went back and started life up all over again, in spite of the fact that his home was destroyed. I said to him, why aren't you depressed? Your home was just destroyed. And he said, because we're in the midst of war, what else can we do? And that's the sense I come away with, a sense of hope, and especially because of Oscar Anulfo Romero, the bishop here.
Jim, thank you very much for showing us your slides. We'll look forward to hearing from you further on the subjects you've mentioned in our panel discussion a little bit later. And now I'd like to introduce Charles Kelly. Charles is a lifetime resident of Somerville, and you've recently returned from a trip to Nicaragua with the Artists Brigade.
Right.
Can you describe what the Artists Brigade is and what the purpose of your trip to Nicaragua was?
Well, the Artists Brigade was made up of 20 artists, 10 muralists and 10 musicians. And they went to Nicaragua as culture workers to share their skills and to show other Nicaraguans that there were North Americans who supported what was going on in Nicaragua. And the purpose of my videotape was to document that, but also to explore Nicaragua and to develop some contacts with the people down there.
And what were some of you must have spent quite a bit of time visiting with people and getting to know people on a personal and artistic level. And what were some of your impressions about how the people in Nicaragua are feeling about their own government, and also about how they're feeling about the United States and the role of the United States is playing now in Nicaragua?
Right. Well, like Jim says, you get this sense of incredible hope from these people. They're very beautiful people, and that's the first impression I got, was just that it was just a free country. I was in a free country for the first time, and it just fills you up, and you get a lot of hope from the people. I was always welcomed. I lived with several families, and it was just a very beautiful and moving experience. The feeling that they have is like what Jim says, is that they want you to go back and tell the people in the United States of America what is going on down there, that what the media feeds the United States population is totally inaccurate. They're very happy with what they have. They want it. They fought hard with it. They lost 50,000 Nicaraguan people a lot in the struggle to get what they have. They will not just roll over and give it up. They're a very young population. 75% of the population is under 21. And then they're very determined. The dissenting people are a very small minority. They're a very bourgeois population who who miss the comforts, the bourgeois comforts, but the workers and everyone like that are very for their revolution that they fought so hard to get.
You said that it's very important for you to go back to this country and portray, sort of, as Jim mentioned before, be a voice for them. What are some of their feelings and thoughts about what the United States' role in Nicaragua is now?
Well, the Nicaraguan people are much more informed and have, I felt, a much more firm grasp on the world events and how it affects them. They could separate us from the government. They saw us as North Americans. They didn't see us as representatives of the United States government. They realize is that it's up to the people in this country, that their hope is that the people of this country will turn things around and stop Reaganism and his policies, his insane policies down there. I saw the evidence, like Jim saw, of the Contras and the deaths and the pain it delivers, but these, again, they could overcome that and move forward. Of course, they see that that the United States policies are very threatening to them, and they're prepared for it. Like, you go to people's houses, they have trenches in the back of every home. You know, they're ready for the invasion. They're just waiting for it.
Can you then describe a little bit, tell us, you're going to show us your videotape. Can you describe what we're about to see, or tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's very short segments. Basically, it's the segments that I videotaped when I traveled up north, within some towns that are very close to the Honduran border, Kiali, Somoto, Sanacala. And you'll see some people performing, a group of artists, musicians perform to the Nicaraguan people to show solidarity with the Nicaraguan people.
Good. Well, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming. And a little bit later, we'll ask you to join our studio audience so that if people have questions for you as well as for the panelists, you'll be able to answer them.
All right.
Good. Now let's look at Charles Kelly's videotape.
Sin una juventud dispuesta al sacrificio. ¡No hay revolución! ¡Juventud! ¡Sandinista! 19 de julio. ¡Juventud! ¡Sandinista! 19 de julio. Juventud y la defensa. Juventud sandinista 19 de julio. ¿Dónde están los cachorros de Sandino? Aquí, allá, el yanqui morirá. Aquí, allá, el yanqui morirá.
La riña del hogar, cuando está rocanroleando, la riña del hogar. Mi jefe me dijeron ya no baile rock and roll, y si vienes con la plaga tu domingo se acabó, ahí viene la plaga. Me gusta bailar, ahí viene la plaga. Me gusta bailar, cuando está rocanroleando, la riña del hogar. Cuando está rocanroleando, la riña del hogar. Vamos con el cura porque me quiero casar. No es que sea muy bonita, lo que sabes es bailar. Ahí viene la plaga. Me gusta bailar. Ahí viene la plaga. Me gusta bailar. Cuando está rocanroleando, la riña del hogar. Cuando está rocanroleando, la riña del hogar.
Ellos también son parte de la marginación por parte del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Por eso es que ellos hoy se unen con nuestro pueblo para unir sus esfuerzos y para darse cuenta de la misma realidad que nosotros vivimos y de que ellos viven en los Estados Unidos. Les vamos a hacer la presentación de cada uno de ellos para que ustedes se den cuenta y se plasmen esos nombres que están llenos de solidaridad con el pueblo de Quilalí y el pueblo de Nicaragua. Paris Psaros, de Brasil.
soy Brian Folkins Amador de Nuevo México.
Soy Laura Burns de Washington, D.C.
Soy Roger Rosen de Boston.
Soy Alicia Santa Clara de Boston.
Alfredo Vivoni de Puerto Rico.
Kelly, Boston.
Charles Kelly.
Para iniciar,
Victor Sanchez, New York.
hay algunos que se infiltran en la solidaridad. Y nos faltaba el compañero de Brasil y el de México. Y no los habíamos pronunciado, pero ellos se dieron a conocer de que están infiltrados porque queremos unir más esfuerzos para aplastar al enemigo invasor. Entonces, para dar inicio a este acto cultural, los compañeros mezclados de Estados Unidos, México, Brasil, Puerto Rico, nos van a cantar una canción muy conocida por todos ustedes y que ellos quieren que ustedes los acompañen. La canción se llama La Consigna. ¡Viva el Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional!
¡Viva! ¡Pueblo! ¡Ejército! ¡Unidad! ¡Garantía de la victoria!
Bueno, antes de que empecemos, quisiera hacer otra presentación. Quiero decirles que esta gente que está con nosotros, los videógrafos que ya se han presentado, van a estar con nosotros en todo este viaje, toda esta gira que estamos haciendo por la región 1, y que ellos están haciendo un recuerdo, haciendo videos de las presentaciones que hacemos y también de los públicos. Así que a lo mejor les van a filmar a ustedes un poco y yo quiero que ustedes no tengan miedo, que no sean tímidos, que relájense, disfrutan del concierto y a lo mejor un día salen en la televisión.
Buenas noches, compañeros. Decir que nosotros somos internacionalistas es decir que unos de nosotros somos gringos sandinistas. Por eso canten con nosotros, por favor. Hermano, dame tu mano y unidos marchemos ya hacia el sol de la victoria, trayectoria de la libertad. Hermano de la montaña, hermano de la ciudad, juntos unidos lucharemos y unidos lograremos llegar al final. Ya nadie detiene la avalancha de un pueblo que tomó su decisión. Esta es la guerra desatada, la guerra prolongada contra el opresor. Esta es la guerra desatada, la guerra prolongada contra el opresor. ¿Cuál es la consigna? El pueblo no se detiene.
Welcome back to the studio. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight. On my left is Peter Elajam, who's a Somerville resident who has been working on the Somerville Central America referendum campaign. On my right is Jim Harney, whose slides we saw earlier. And on my far right is Roxana Pastor, a Honduran native who is the coordinator of the Honduras Information Center. She travels to Honduras every 4 months. Good. Now I'd like to begin the discussion with several prepared questions, and then at a later point I'll announce the telephone number of the station, so you can call in with questions if you have them. The first question is, the situation in Central America is very confusing to most North Americans, I think. Can you give us some highlights of the situation in several of the different countries there?
Well, let me just say it's confusing simply because Reagan is making it confusing, and he's putting it within East-West confrontational politics. And that's not the case. It's poverty in El Salvador, it's poverty in Honduras, in Guatemala, the whole region that's causing the ferment. And in El Salvador, the war's been going on for 4 years. People have been committed to working through this whole process. I mentioned earlier the second chance that the people are trying to get. Well, Reagan's doing all that he can to prevent that from occurring, doing everything. And he's trying to be effective at it. He's trying to stop or confuse the electoral process in Nicaragua, which is truly a democratic process, much fairer than what took place in El Salvador. The elections in El Salvador were really a joke. It was fear. People have a padlock on their mouths there, and they don't talk because of fear. And the CIA pushed $600,000 in through the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany. And then they funneled it to a public relations firm in Venezuela, who in turn did all of the propaganda for the Duarte campaign free of charge. Now, on the contrary, the Sandinists are giving equal amount of money to all of the candidates, that the Sandinists aren't getting any more money than the Socialist Party there. And that's going to make much fairer elections. They're going to get equal time on television. They have equal time or equal space in the newspaper. They're getting equal amount of gas so they can travel around the country. And gas is in a good deal of shortage here simply because the CIA blew up the Corinto oil port there.
Roxana?
I think that Jim and you are both right on saying that Central America is very confusing. One of the things that we need to do is, first of all, to take it out of the East-West perspective and to think of Central America as a region, but also as independent countries that are different among themselves. In my country, in Honduras, we have people that are not at war, that are trying to survive despite of the poverty of the country. Honduras is the second poorest country in this hemisphere. And yet the Reagan administration has chosen to, instead of helping these people build the democracy, to give them military aid. So we see that in 1979, the U.S. administration gave Honduras $4 million in military aid, and in 1984, the Reagan administration is asking for more than $70 million of military aid to Honduras, that is a country that is not at war. But all the countries are different. In Guatemala, we have the case that more than 70% of the population are indigenous people that don't even speak Spanish. And yet we are attempting to think of them as just one more Central American, one more person that lives in this land that the Reagan administration has seen as a strategic place to defend its security. And I think it's a little bit more than a fight between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's about people that are trying to survive, that are fighting for basic human needs that people in this country just take for granted.
Well, one of the justifications that the Reagan administration has given for the considerable amount of military aid is that it's very important to defend democracy in Central America. Do you think that this, to defend democracy and also to keep the Russians and the Cubans from taking over, and both of you have referred to the East-West struggle that the Reagan administration continues to mention. Are we defending democracy in Central America? And if not, what is it that we are indeed doing there?
Democracy, it doesn't exist simply because of the immense poverty. Say in El Salvador, where they say there's a thriving democracy under Duarte. Mm-hmm. Well, you have almost 85% unemployment when you consider all the unemployment, 50%, and then people who work for less than the minimum wage. It comes to around 85% of the economically active or of the population is unemployed. And when they're living in unbelievable poverty, you can't speak about democracy. The kind of democracy that you have in El Salvador is hunger and unemployment, as one priest told me. And he said, you're trying to model democracy and what's going on in the United States. So it's really missing the point to think that democracy under present conditions in El Salvador or in Honduras or Guatemala can ever take place unless there's a change in structures, and what's going on down here is not doing that.
That's right. I think that we can't speak about democracy in countries where 40 children die of hunger every day. The Reagan administration has chosen to tell the North American people that these are democratic countries because there were democratic elections there. And if we follow history, we see that in the past 2-3 years, every Central American country has had an election. And if we look into the books and reading between lines, we see that the United States has backed all those elections, and Jim already described some of the procedures that were used in the election in El Salvador. The reality is that, yes, elections can bring democracy, but elections don't equal democracy. The United States cannot save a democracy that doesn't exist. More than that, I think the current foreign policy of this administration not only is not defending democracy, but has undermined the little democracy that there was once in Central America. So I don't think that we can speak about Cuban or Soviet threat. I think we need to first remember that the number of dollars that this administration is spending in Central America is far above any Soviet or Cuban aid that any Central American country is receiving. And second, the number of North American soldiers, Marines, that are already in Central America are far more than any Cuban or Soviet presence. So the threat doesn't really exist. Central Americans don't talk about being afraid of the Cubans and the Soviets coming. I think it's kind of childish to think that the Soviets are just thinking where are they going to go next. And Central Americans are really talking about what am I going to eat tomorrow? And how can I support a government that is only militarizing the country instead of giving us food, giving us jobs, and giving us education?
Well, you have a lot of questions after both Jim and Roxana's comments, and after I'm going to ask a series of questions on the referendum campaign itself. And at that point, feel free to call in with any questions you may have for any of the panelists here or for Charles Kelly, who spoke earlier. And the phone number to call is 628-8826. If you have questions for any of the panelists, we'll be taking them after the next questions. Peter, you've been working on the Central America referendum campaign in Somerville. Can you describe the referendum question,
Sure,
first
yeah.
of all?
I think the first point is that we're encouraging Somerville residents to vote in favor of this referendum question, which calls on the United States to stop sending military aid to all these Central American countries. Maybe I could read the referendum question just because it's powerful in its wording. It reads as follows: shall the representative from this district be instructed to vote in favor of a resolution calling on the United States Congress and the President of the United States to immediately withdraw all troops and advisors from El Salvador and Honduras, stop any and all military aid to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and stop any and all aid to the forces fighting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, and to direct funds now used for such purposes to the domestic economy to create jobs and improve services. It's the way the question reads.
What are some of the things that the referendum campaign has been doing? What do they hope to do in Somerville?
Okay, I think twofold. We really want to encourage as many people as possible to vote in favor of the question, so that we make it clear to the Somerville community and to the Reagan administration that Somerville residents are not in favor of sending military aid to Central America. Our plans, I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
What kinds of things have you been doing to educate the people in Somerville, or what kinds
Sure.
of things?
We have been going throughout the community leafleting before the election, dropping off leaflets, thousands of leaflets at people's doorways so that people can have some information about the question. We've leaflet at Sullivan Station in Somerville. We've had tables throughout the community to inform people, answer questions about what the issues are about Central America.
You have a leaflet there. People have probably received these on their doorstep.
This is a copy of I think we've dropped off about 10,000 of these leaflets throughout the Somerville community, and many of you in Somerville have these and should refer to them and take the time to look at them.
And finally, just I've heard from people in Somerville wondering about, who are very concerned with their jobs here and what's going on right in Somerville. Why, in your opinion, why should people in Somerville become involved in this issue, or what effect does it have on the people who are actually living right here?
I think there are a number of reasons why Somerville citizens should be involved. First of all, it's our government which is doing this. It's not a foreign government which is sending military to Central America. That's my government, and that's our government. Second of all, that money is our money. We pay for that in our taxes. And rather than supporting what's going on, sending this military aid to Central America, we are saying we would rather have that spent here on the domestic economy to improve social services.
Good. Thanks, Peter. We have a phone call now, so we'll hear from caller. Hello, this is Dead Air Live. You're on the air.
Okay, I just have a comment for the host. I'd like to know why there isn't any opposing views on the show right now. And I also would, in comment to Mr. Kelly's question on, he felt that he was in a free country in Nicaragua. Well, in Nicaragua, there used to be numerous newspapers, and now there's only one state newspaper. And to me, that's not democratic, and that's not freedom of speech. And I just want to leave that. All right?
Okay, thank you very much. Peter would like to comment on
Yeah.
the first question.
I think it's a fair question to ask why we don't have people representing the other side. I think what's important to point out is that the other side gets all the time. You don't get a chance to hear people like Jim Harney and Roxana, and to get a different perspective, you get the Reagan administration's perspective that it's positive, that we're supporting the democracies in Central America. And this is not a perspective that you often get. So on the contrary, I think it's very important to hear this perspective very clearly, and I think it's important that we've taken the time to do that.
The other thing is that this is not a debate. This is a panel discussion. And now I'd like to hear Charles Kelly in answer to the second part of the question.
Well, why I thought Nicaragua was a free country? Well, it's very simple. I lived in this city all my life. When I went down there, you can feel a sense of freedom amongst the people. They have political freedom. They have economic freedoms that this country doesn't understand. I believe the major problem of this country is that we've been so brainwashed, so to speak, so fed with what we think democracy is. We don't understand the truth anymore. And we have a difficult time digesting the truth, digesting that there is actually democracy in the world much better than our own. We can't deal with the truth.
Okay, thank you. Roxana would also like to respond to that question.
Yeah, I just have a very brief comment. The fact that the caller mentioned that in Nicaragua there's only one state newspaper now, that is not true. There are 3 major newspapers in Nicaragua that are not owned by the state. And yes, there has been some censorship of the press, but it is not true that newspapers have been abolished. And as a matter of fact, the censorship is to a lesser degree at this point, and La Prensa, that is the opposition newspaper, continues to print its daily paper every day.
Thank you. We have another phone call. Hello, this is Dead Air Live. You're on the air. Hello?
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi. I'd just like to say I'm really glad you're doing this show, and I feel that you're showing the right point of view, how the truth is. And I like the slides, and I'd like to thank Kelly for sharing his videotape with us.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Jim, you also had a response to the previous question. Do you want to...
Yeah, the caller didn't mention the press in El Salvador. I had the misfortune one day to walk into La Crónica the day it was blown up. And El Independiente, I knew Jorge Pinto, he's in exile now. There's no opposition newspaper. It's all, the newspapers represent the 14 families in El Salvador. You never get a different point of view. The Reagan administration never speaks about that. We're always hitting La Prensa, the one in Nicaragua, because that's a press that's being violated there. And it's very deliberate because it's to discredit the Nicaraguan process. We never try to discredit the Salvadoran process because they're friends of ours. And the military is in good company there with us.
Yeah, I think that the point that you mentioned, what the Reagan administration has chosen to not tell the U.S. citizens is very important. We have heard many press conferences, many speeches that Reagan has given to the population about what's going on in Central America. He says, we only have 55 U.S. military advisors in El Salvador, but he never says how many military advisors there are in Honduras. So, although we can believe that there are some problems in Central America, we also need to question what we are hearing. And that's why it's important for the other side to get a time to talk about those things.
Thank you. I have another question. People can feel free to continue calling in, but in the meantime, people have talked about the upcoming election as being one that the upcoming United States presidential election as one that will be very critical for determining policy in Central America. What are your thoughts about how the outcome of the election will affect people in Central America?
People are afraid in Central America if Reagan gets elected. A priest at the Catholic University one time told me when I was leaving, he said, you know, Jim, if it wasn't for people resisting President Reagan's position in Central America, he said, we would have been blown off the face of the earth long ago. See, in El Salvador, the whole Vietnam syndrome is really beginning to flourish. It's beginning to hit its peak with the air war, because we craterized Vietnam. We have thousands of craters, about 20 feet deep, radius of 18 feet. I mean, it's just like terrible what we did there. But we're in the process of doing that now in El Salvador. And if Reagan gets elected, it's just horrendous what's going to happen. People are dug in the countryside. You saw all the tunnels, and all the trenches that people are. With Reagan being elected, there's a good possibility of direct military intervention in El Salvador. He'll have 4 years of carte blanche. You know, like he's got the backing of the people, he'll say. So he can do whatever he wants.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, the studio audience, that we're going to take now.
I have two questions. The first is, the Reagan administration justifies the intervention in Central America by saying that there's a Soviet threat, but our intervention predates the East-West conflict as we see it now by many years. And so it seems to me that there's some kind of pattern there, perhaps some hidden agenda, some other reason for our intervention that we don't hear about. I'd like to hear a comment on that. And the second question I have is, Reagan claims that there are Soviet arms and Cuban advisors in Central America. Is that true? Is there evidence of that? And if so, why is it not justification for U.S. military aid?
I'll start, and Jim, please continue and feel free to interrupt. I think you are right when you say that U.S. intervention in Central America predates the East-West conflict. And just in the past week, we have read in the major newspapers in the United States that one of the big goals and one of the big achievements of the Reagan administration in Central America has been to create a comic book that was distributed among the Nicaraguan people, the Nicaraguan counter-revolution, to tell them how to assassinate people, to tell them how to plug toilets, to tell them to call and make reservations in hotels and then never show up. Because according to them, in this way, they can overthrow the Nicaraguan revolution. I think the Reagan administration is fighting an ideological war in Central America. It is not a war that makes any sense. It is not rational. It's an ideological war, and it is being financed by the people of the United States. And I think it's very important to know the difference between an East-West conflict and an ideological war. There are many arguments over, are there Soviet guns in Central America? Are there Cuban advisors in Central America? Yes, there are Cuban advisors in Central America. There are Cuban advisors in Nicaragua. The great majority of those advisors are people that are advising the Nicaraguans what to do in the health and education areas. But there are also military advisors. However, the number of Soviet guns, if there are any, I haven't seen them, and the number of Cuban advisors in Central America is minimum, as I said before. And we really need to think about the millions of dollars that the United States is giving to El Salvador and to Honduras and to the counter-revolution in Central America, more than how many guns there are. One of the main arguments that the Reagan administration makes is that there is a flow of arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador. However, to this day, the Reagan administration cannot provide evidence of that flow of arms. And I think that we all know that the United States has enough military technology to provide that evidence if it existed. Jim, I don't know if you had something else to add.
Well, most of the foreign press that I've met in El Salvador have told me that there's really no evidence of arms flow or anything like that from Nicaragua. And it's very, very difficult because Nicaragua doesn't touch El Salvador. You have to go through Honduras, and you've got to go through some 15,000 Contras who are along the border. I mean, what they got is these infrared monitors flown in C-130 transport planes.
Right.
And they fly around, they see dots on the ground, and they say, oh yeah, that's, these are the arms coming in. It's just a ploy, I think. When I talked to the Salvadorans in the countryside, they told me they're getting all their weapons from the Salvadoran army who have been killed or wounded, disappeared. And they're taking over a lot of military outposts in the countryside also, which in that way they acquire weapons. They're also buying them from the Salvadoran army. The corruption is everywhere in the Salvadoran army.
We need to begin to wrap up our discussion here. Do you have any comments on the last part about the, of the question? So any other last comment?
I don't recall what that last question was.
We'll just.
I wanted to. Can we get the question again? That last second part.
Oh, whether there's some kind of hidden agenda.
The last part of the question was, the questioner was wondering whether there's some sort of a hidden agenda as well. You may have answered that already, but if you have any last comments.
See, the agenda for the Reagan administration is to stop a liberation process going on in Central America. That's the primary objective. And people speak about the militarization of foreign policy. And Reagan doesn't want peace. He wants to destroy a popular movement. And that's the real agenda. And it's all underneath all of the East-West confrontational politics, but it's to destroy the peasants.
Good. We need to wrap up conversation now. Thank you very much for being here, Roxana Pastor, Jim Harney, Peter Elajim, and Charles Kelly. And thank you for listening. We're going to close the program tonight with some music from a group called Duo Guardabarranco, which is a brother-sister duo from Nicaragua that you also heard in the very beginning of the program with Jim Harney's slides. Thank you very much for tuning in to Dead Air Live tonight. Just one last reminder, the Central America referendum question will be number 1 on the Somerville ballot. And if you want to tell your representative to vote against sending military aid to Central America, then you need to vote yes for peace in Central America on question 1. If you have further questions about the referendum campaign or want to volunteer some time, you can give us a call, give the central office a call, and the phone number is 247-1577. Again, that's 247-1577. Thank you very much, and good night.
Con una aguja, con hilo blanco, con la carrucha en tu regazo. Cóseme el flanco, la herida aguda y la negra llaga de mi costado. Con una aguja, con hilo blanco, con la carrucha en tu regazo, cóseme el flanco, la herida aguda y la negra llaga de mi costado.